My morning had been spent amongst the myriad of treasures held beneath the great glass ceilings of Musée d'Orsay. Originally known as Gare d'Orsay and designed in the eclectic 19th century Beaux Arts style, this former train station had been converted to hold a collection of France's greatest art some 30 years previously. The museum's moods had seemed to shift subtly with each play of the mid-morning light across its high steel ribcage, casting glows and shadows over ballerinas by Degas, water lilies by Monet, vivid nighttime scenes by Van Gogh, and the chocolate box paintings of Monsieur Renoir. Room after room of polished floors and dark walls hung with priceless artworks and illuminated by soft spotlights. By noon, my mind was awash with dancing colours and brushstrokes and the history of Paris and its many famous visitors. So much so that I felt the need for a blank canvas of my own, from behind which I could observe the city's many shoppers and tourists and lovers. I decided a quiet cup of hot chocolate was in order, and so I left the museum by the entrance on Rue de Lille, and ambled for a bit until the perfect rest stop made itself known to me. A bistro on the corner had tables perched cheerily outside, and had not yet succumbed to the throng of the lunchtime crowd. I took my place beneath the long striped canopy and, feeling like I might have been sitting in the days of the salon, I exhaled slowly and let the scene take me over. Montmartre was an hour's uphill walk north of my little café as the crow flies. Crossing the Seine and watching the portrait artists and street performers would surely refresh me were I to wander up that way. But the inevitable climb to the summit of Sacré-Cœur would leave me too exhausted to enjoy the landscape I'd have climbed 270 steps to observe. It was always the way. I seemed to be terminally unable to enjoy Montmartre without succumbing to the desire to climb to its highest peak. And so, sipping on the thick mug of chocolate before me, with a warm, savoury croissant to accompany it, I decided I would move with the sun today. I would head west. A while later, I was on my way back towards the glimmering River Seine, and stepping down into the refreshingly cool metro station, which served the yellow line to Versailles. An elderly man wearing a feathered trilby picked out a line of complex jazz on a warm-sounding guitar in the vestibule. He seemed lost in another world as he played, barely aware of his fingers as they bounced lightly around the fretboard. Moving beyond him and onto the platform only seemed to improve the acoustics of his song as it lit up every shadowy corner of the station. I sat myself down on a tiled bench nearby and laid my head back on the wall behind me. I allowed my eyes to close and to sink back away from my eyelids. Someone once told me this was a good way to calm the thoughts and emotions which emanated from the brain's frontal lobe, and indeed I always found it very helpful in coming back into myself, into my center. Moments into my meditation, my 2-story train carriage arrived and opened its doors to me. What I loved about this journey was the fact of Versailles being the last stop on the line. No worrying about watching for signs or accidentally falling asleep. I was free to just be, to observe if I wished, and yes, even to have a little doze. I barely noticed the stops go by. Invalides, Champ de Mars, Javel. I was roused some time thereafter by the sudden shaft of daylight which filled the carriage and announced that Versailles Chateau Rive Gauche was nearby. Office buildings and apartment blocks huddled in the arrondissement which had sprung up around Versailles in the centuries since its conversion into France's principal royal residence. I marvelled at what it must be like to have such an opulent and revered palace within walking distance of one's home or workplace. I wondered if the working people of Paris enjoyed the same feeling of escapism from visiting the decadent dwelling as its innumerable visitors did. The train slowed to a gentle stop now, and the bright and cheery station waited patiently beyond for me. I stepped down from my 2nd-story sun trap and, stopping only to acquire a pain au chocolat for the walk, I made my way outside and toward the expansive Avenue de Paris. The tree-lined avenue buzzed with traffic and hordes of school children being shepherded about by their teachers. As I approached the fan-shaped Place d'Armes, the scene grew more restful as tourists ambled towards the palace's main gate and sat about, checking maps and sipping at water bottles. The heat of the sun was like a tonic to my skin. The muscles in my neck and shoulders unwound with each unhurried step, supported lovingly by my lower back, which was enjoying the stretch immensely. Up ahead, the palace opened its welcoming arms to me from behind shining golden gates. A flare of rainbow colours twirled and quivered in the breeze as a young woman released a long trailing bubble from her whirling wire frame. The palace's mishmash of architectural detail began to come slowly into focus. Gilded rooftops and window frames gleamed in the sunlight atop rows of Romanesque pillars and statues. A pious and devout king, Louis XIV, had artfully managed to pacify the aristocracy of France throughout his reign which, having lasted for 72 years, was the longest held in the history of the European monarchy. Indeed, the wonderland of gardens and apartments that he created for them here at Ile-de-France had no doubt played an important role in his success. Known as the Sun King, his belief in his absolute and divine right of power is evident everywhere in the palace's grand design. His chief architect on Versailles' renovations was Louis Le Vau, who was succeeded upon his death in 1670 by his assistant François d'Orbay. Both men had overseen such works as to befit even the grandest temple in the decadent days of ancient Rome during their time at the palace. Stepping towards the front door now, it was easy to imagine the ladies of the court arriving for the first time in their fine hats and robes à la Française in varying shades of rococo silk, and gasping at the finery within. The palace's new entrance in the Pavillon du Fort, however, is a momentarily contrasting experience. Designed by Dominique Perrault, the stark and abstract lobby is pleasantly surprising in its liberal application of brass decoration, which seems to burst forth from the ceiling, sweeping across its floor and along its walls, like a permanent modernist homage to the Sun King, who first breathed life into the palace as we know it today. I had read in a newspaper some time back that Perrault had described his contribution as a hyphen between centuries, and indeed it did seem to make a fitting addition to the array of historical architecture on display throughout the complex. As with the rest of Versailles, it is very much of its time. I found myself now in the marble courtyard, face to face with the intricate red brick facade of Louis XIII's original chateau, which had been added to his meagre but much-loved hunting lodge during his reign. The facade rises before the black and white tiled courtyard like a highly decorated dauphine who sits in her embellished pink dress at the centre of the royal scene. It was this comparatively modest chateau which Louis XIV had envisioned as the new seat of power for the French monarchy, when he began to commission the extensions of wing and garden which would comfortably house Versailles' thousands of noble courtiers and their entourages throughout his reign. Entering and perusing the king's chambers made me wonder what it must have been like to have stayed at Versailles all those years ago. To rise early in the morning and be painted and dressed in silks and velvets by one's attendants, before rushing to the Salon of Mercury to witness the king's symbolic rising with the sun ceremony, as well as his washing, combing, and dressing rituals. Only the choicest of attendees to Versailles were party to this daily levee, as they would stand in the viewing gallery, beneath Mercury and his chariot, and share in whispered tones the news and gossip of the day. It was a place to see and be seen, and occurred in a similar manner each morning for the Queen and her attendants on the other side of the palace. As the Sun King, Louis had felt it appropriate to display paintings of himself amongst those of the Roman deities after whom he had named the many rooms in his apartments. The salons had each been designed by Charles Le Brun and inspired by the decorative style of Florence's Pitti Palace. Deep, rich colour palettes lend their warmth to the Sistine-esque proportion of the ceilings, where one can see depicted the exploits of such rulers as Augustus and Alexander the Great, as well as mythical scenes pertaining to the room's namesakes. The Salon of Diana, for example, had for a long time contained a billiards table trimmed with red velvet, whilst Diana, representing Louis's own hunting prowess, proceeded over a hunt above the guests' heads. The room's decor is cooler in colour than the other salons, since Diana is also the goddess of the moon. The Salon of Apollo depicted the sun god himself, pulling the sun across the sky in his chariot, an act which seemed to be mirrored in the palace's east to west axis, and which lent great significance to Louis's morning and evening rituals. Further to this, the salon's tapestries would have been changed twice each year for summer and winter, from rich red velvet worked with gold during the colder months, to similarly coloured silk versions during the bright months of endless heat. It was the room where Louis had placed his throne, now lost and replaced by a gilded wooden chair on a dais. A huge portrait of the Sun King, with his soft dark eyes and rolling sable curls, hangs above the fireplace now, with a portrait of his great-great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, on the wall directly opposite. Beyond the weighty atmosphere of Apollo and his pertinent charge, the Salon of Venus stands at the far entrance to the king's apartments, and was used to hold grand displays of food and drink during the king's thrice weekly parties there. It was an ideal place to mingle, and perhaps further things with a love interest, as Venus reclines among cherubs and sends garlands of roses down to the room's revellers amid patterned marble-clad walls. Imagining the glorious strains of Baroque music weaving its way around the whole candlelit scene, threatened to sweep me off into another time. But that would have to wait for later. The next grand doorway was just ahead now, promising a welcome sojourn from the ever more sumptuous enfilade of Les Grands Appartements du Roi, Stepping through the intricately gilded marble archway brought me to one of Versailles' more emblematic features, the Grand Hall of Mirrors. Too large to heat, and therefore containing no fireplaces, the gallery stands at a height of 40 foot and reaches all the way to the palace's attic. During the day, the rich decor would have framed a reflection of the gardens outside in the hallway's 350 mirrored panels. By night, it would have amplified the ambience of the candlelight, making it a breathtaking venue for only the largest and most opulent of balls and parties. I allowed myself to be led by the gentle flow of the day's visitors onwards towards the Queen's apartments. I would while my time away amongst the palace's cool marble staircases and antechambers until the parching afternoon sun had lowered itself somewhat in the sky. The Queen's apartments seemed even finer in contrast to the bold reds and yellow golds of the King's. Pale blues and greens and ivories evoked summery images of a young Marie Antoinette, painted in soft, flowery portraits, in her desire to portray a warm and feminine likability to the people of her new nation. Delicately gilded marble and panelled doorways were all made to be generous in width, in order to allow for the wide panniers and hats and ruched dresses of the ladies of the court as they made their way here and there throughout the Queen's rooms and beyond. Velvet upholstered chairs had broad fan-shaped cushions, and armrests were small and set back to allow for the accoutrements and sculpted skirts which made waists seem smaller and hips appear much larger. It was no wonder the place seemed to be dripping with furniture designed for sitting down, since it would presumably have been far preferable to standing when carrying such heavy attire around one's person all day and all evening. Even gentlemen in their gold-embroidered waistcoats and wigs would eventually have succumbed to the high-heeled court shoes which were so in vogue at the time. I mused on how difficult it must have been for anyone sporting the most fashionable shoes of the day to creep unheard between chambers along a marble-tiled hallway when the occasion had so demanded it. Of course, there were secret doorways everywhere. One, barely discernible amongst the heavily patterned gilding and tapestries of the Queen's bedchamber, had allowed Marie Antoinette to make her escape from her bedroom when news came that the French people had risen, with her among their targets. I wondered at how many nights before that night would have been spent there by her and by her predecessors, in peace, behind the gilded balustrade and the thick patterned curtains of the lit à la Française, which separated them from the outside world at night. Modest copper bathtubs, lined with linen sheets and baskets full of gowns and stockings and night dresses, would have passed like clockwork through the chamber doors throughout the day. But once the nightly rituals of the Queen had been completed, she would retire to bed and quietly await her husband's arrival at the end of his elaborate coucher ritual in his public bedchamber. The stillness must have been a welcome change from the busyness of the day and the many demands made by the etiquette of the French royal court. How soft the mattress must have felt to weary bones. How cloud-like the pillows of finest cotton. For Marie Antoinette, the only thing that could improve the experience was a wisp of her favorite perfume, the delicate scent of orange blossom. My memory evoked the citrusy notes and pulled me gently back once again from candlelit visions of long ago, and reminded me of outside the fountains, the manicured orangerie, le petit Trianon, and, most curiously of all, the quaint little hamlet which Marie Antoinette had built amongst the palace gardens. I made my way there now, back to the ground floor, back through Cour Tonnerre and the courtyard of Princes, out into the glorious sunshine and the crystal clear air of the early evening. The temperature had lowered to a pleasantly gentle heat, as the landscape which enveloped the golden gravel pathway ahead became greener and lusher and almost wild. I was sure I could hear the heavenly cascading of a harp from somewhere nearby, and suddenly the windmill appeared up ahead of me from behind tall and ancient trees. This area of the chateau grounds stands uniquely above all others in both form and function, used as much to teach the children of the palace about the production of food and care of animals as for pure escapism, revelry, and pleasure. The Queen's hamlet, though disliked by many, was positively beloved and depended upon by its regal patron. Marie Antoinette would spend increasing amounts of time tending to dairy cows and chickens and carrying out light chores amongst the gardens there, which also served as the palace's main source of sustenance. At times she would have had close friends for company, amongst the timber-framed, lime-rendered cottages, and if she wished to see no one, it was understood that she would remain undisturbed in her little village. Here she was free, as the heavy-set finery of chateau evening wear was traded for light gowns of muslin and straw hats. I ambled as though in a dream among the picturesque Norman-inspired thatched cottages. Several had been permanently occupied by ordinary families after their construction, and the others had been frequently used to host gatherings and certain events for the entourage of Queen Marie Antoinette. It gave the fairy tale, almost movie set aesthetic of the scene a tangibly warm and lived-in quality which was drawing me into itself now. Nestled in the fold behind two such cottages, I found a small, tidy lawn of soft grass inside a bright boundary of wildflowers and roses, and yes, even what looked like the early stages of a pumpkin patch. I looked around to make certain I was alone, and, upon deciding my only companion to be the rotund and furry bumblebee currently making its way from bloom to vivid bloom, sank to my knees upon the soft, mossy carpet below. Sweet and scintillating scents of summer blossoms clung to the warm air which was emanating from the surrounding structures and the exhaling earth below me. I surrendered completely now to the cornucopian fantasies of bygone eras, to the passionate heat of the ground beneath me, which seemed to rise from the core of the earth itself, to the heady elixir of flower essences which enveloped me now, and to the weight of my own heavy and satisfied frame. My lower back dropped to kiss the soil. My toes curled around the soothing breeze. My chest rose to greet the sun as I breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, and breathe out. My brow unfurls, my hands become light, and I'm gone on a zephyr, hidden safely behind thick velvet